Ethiopia. And they went far, far beyond the parts of Ethiopia where there are Somali-speaking people. Ethiopia has 90 different ethnic groupings. The question of holding together the territorial integrity of Ethiopia is extremely difficult and important, because otherwise they could be splintered into a million pieces. And that's exactly what the imperialists wanted to do. So there was a big invasion and a war that lasted for quite some time. And finally, with technical support from Cuba and from the Soviet Union, Ethiopia defeated the invasion, and finally Somalia had to withdraw their troops. But it was after about a year. And when you think of what that experience did to Somalia, I mean, just think of the Somali people. You know, one day their government says they're for socialism. The next day they're claiming that the enemy is Ethiopia. At the time, the papers were saying, oh, Ethiopia is going to invade Somalia. Ethiopia is going to invade Somalia. Ethiopia never invaded Somalia under Mengistu. Somalia invaded Ethiopia. Now there are Ethiopian troops in Somalia fighting against the groups there that the U.S. can't get control over. So it's just, everything's been completely reversed. The other front was, and the big problem for Ethiopia was Eritrea, because Eritrea had had an independence struggle for some time. And at the time of the Haile Selassie regime, when Haile Selassie was lined up with U.S. imperialism, had a base in Eritrea that the Haile Selassie regime wanted, agreed to. I'm sorry, I forgot the beginning of this sentence. But anyway, there had been a long period of independence, struggle for independence. And progressive groups, including our party, had supported that struggle. But then when the Ethiopian Revolution happened, clearly the Ethiopians and the Eritrean revolutionaries had the need to unite against imperialism. And Ethiopia offered many times to negotiate. But the Eritrean movement, instead of moving towards some kind of an accommodation with Ethiopia, instead, internally, there was a shift to the right, where what had been a leftist Eritrean movement blocked with a rightist movement, and even with this army of Ethiopian landlords called the EDU. So it was a whole new situation, and one where our party position, and we tried to explain it in the movement here, was that in the interest of fighting imperialism, there should be unity, and it was not, we would support the Ethiopian Revolution in their efforts to keep the country united. This was a very contentious issue in the United States at the time, and most on the left were instead talking about freedom for Eritrea. They were talking about freedom for the Ogaden, and treating it as though what had happened with Somalia was all some indigenous movement of Somalis living inside Ethiopia, which has proven to be totally not true. So this struggle ground down Ethiopia very, very much. And then what happened, as we all know, is that a crisis came in the socialist camp. And by 1991, the Soviet Union had disintegrated. Eastern Europe was no longer socialist. And in Ethiopia, in 1991, one of the separatist groups that had been fighting against the Ethiopian government was anointed by the imperialists, supposedly in the name of socialism, by the way, was anointed by the imperialists as they should be the government of Ethiopia. And Mengistu had to go into exile and went to Zimbabwe in 1991, and he's been there ever since. I just want to, there's a lot more to say, but I don't want to take too much more time. I just want to say a little bit about Ethiopia today. I have not seen Ethiopia in 35 years almost. But think I understand pretty well what has been going on, and it's quite interesting. It's not as though the Ethiopian Revolution was entirely in vain, even though the anti-imperialist, pro-socialist leadership that was trying to empower the masses was eventually defeated. In Ethiopia today, the land technically still belongs to the state. They have not gone back to the days of the landlords running it all. I think that if the government tried to do that, it would be overthrown by the peasants. There would be I think there's no question about that. They wouldn't dare to do it. And there are peasants' associations, and they have cooperatives. But what are the conditions like for the peasants? Well, today, the average income in Ethiopia is just a little over $1 a day. That's the average, just a little over $1 a day. So you know that for the peasants, it's $1 or less per day. 60% of Ethiopia's export income comes from coffee. You all have heard about Ethiopian coffee. You know Starbucks makes a big deal out of Ethiopian coffee. They make a big deal out of the fact that in 2006 they finally sort of ended the dispute they had over trademark issues and signed an agreement with Ethiopia that was supposed to be so beneficial to Ethiopia. Well, Ethiopia's income from coffee this year, the first 6 months of this year, just fell to half what it was last year. And I'm not sure whether it's because of conditions in the world market or a resistance on the part of the peasants, some of whom, by the way, are now ripping out their coffee plants and growing things like khat, which is a sort of a semi-narcotic. It's got a natural antihistamine in it, and selling that on the more or less on the illegal market. I'm not sure how illegal it is in all the countries of Africa, but some I know it's illegal. But that's how difficult the peasants find it to survive. The ruling class persists through commerce, through export. Ethiopia is integrated into the world capitalist system. Starbucks sells Ethiopian coffee is very highly regarded as certain brands in particular, certain regions particularly. Those brands, Starbucks has stores, they sell coffee, coffee beans. They charge $26 a pound for Ethiopian coffee. They pay the Ethiopians $2 a pound for their coffee. A small percentage of that actually gets to the peasants themselves, who still have, peasants associations still have cooperatives, but who get no input from the government. They're just, they're just out there kind of on their own, up against the whole capitalist world market. Finally, let's just say this, that it must have been very difficult in 1974 to 78 and well into the 80s to stick to the struggle for socialism in a country like Ethiopia, underdeveloped, tiny working class, with being able to rely less and less on support from a socialist camp. But Mengistu was right. He tried, he never became an opportunist. He never signed an agreement with the imperialists. He never gave up. He was right. He understood that if you're really going to protect the interests of the workers and the peasants, you've got to go all the way. You've got to expropriate the ruling class politically and materially, and empower the working people to set up their own government. That's what he stood for. And I'm sure that when the revolutionary struggle is revived again in Ethiopia, as it will be, the people of Ethiopia will hold high pictures of Mengistu Haile Mariam.